In the early 1930s, Japan was a nation preparing for a war it hoped would be swift and decisive, but one that demanded new tools of mechanized warfare. Among these tools was the Type 95 Ha-Go light tank, a machine that would come to symbolize both the ingenuity and the limitations of Japanese armored design. Designed in 1933 by a small team of engineers who sought to balance speed, mobility, and production efficiency, the Ha-Go was a compact vehicle weighing just over 7 tons, powered by a relatively modest 120 horsepower diesel engine. Its thin 12mm armor and small 37mm main gun reflected the strategic priorities of the Imperial Japanese Army: to move fast, strike hard, and dominate opponents who were not yet fully mechanized. In China, where the tank first proved its worth, these design choices made perfect sense. Roads were limited, the terrain unpredictable, and enemy forces often poorly equipped or dispersed. The Ha-Go could weave through villages, cross rivers with relative ease, and outmaneuver the slower, heavier Chinese vehicles. Crews quickly learned the advantages of mobility over brute force, and the tank became a symbol of Japanese tactical innovation in the opening campaigns of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Its small size allowed a single-man turret crew to operate with surprising efficiency in skirmishes, and in the hands of experienced tankers, it could harass infantry positions, support light artillery, and secure vital bridges or supply routes. Early encounters at places like Khalkhin in 1939 demonstrated that against opponents who lacked sufficient firepower or anti-tank capability, the Ha-Go was a formidable weapon. Japanese officers celebrated these victories, convinced that the tank's design philosophy was correct, and that the same machines could be deployed effectively across the Pacific. But as Japan expanded its reach, invading Malaya, the Philippines, and beyond, the Ha-Go began to encounter an enemy with entirely different capabilities. Unlike Chinese forces, the American and British troops in the Pacific had access to heavier weapons, better communication systems, and, most importantly, tanks and artillery capable of penetrating the Ha-Go's thin armor. Yet even against these emerging threats, the tank's small size and agility allowed Japanese forces to execute rapid flanking maneuvers, launch night attacks, and exploit poorly defended roads and coastal regions. Crews often pushed their machines to the limits, navigating narrow jungle paths and river crossings that would have trapped heavier vehicles. The early days of the Pacific War showed that Japanese mechanized forces were capable of tactical brilliance, even when the tools at their disposal were far from perfect. But beneath these victories lurked an uncomfortable reality. The Ha-Go's armor, designed only to withstand rifle-caliber fire, was utterly inadequate against the .5 caliber machine guns mounted on American half-tracks or the larger cannons of U.S. light tanks. Its single-man turret, which centralized both command and firing responsibilities on a single crew member, left tankers vulnerable to errors, fatigue, and battlefield confusion. In practice, this meant that a single lucky shot could disable the entire vehicle or kill the commander, rendering the tank ineffective. Radios, which were critical for coordinating maneuvers, were scarce or entirely absent in many Ha-Gos, forcing drivers and gunners to rely on hand signals or prearranged plans that often fell apart under fire. These design limitations were not merely theoretical. They became starkly apparent during the battles in Malaya and Singapore, where Japanese tank crews encountered pockets of resistance supported by Allied artillery and anti-tank weapons. In these skirmishes, the Ha-Go's speed offered some protection, but its vulnerability was never far from mind. Crews developed tactics to mitigate these weaknesses, such as night attacks, hit-and-run engagements, and coordinating closely with infantry armed with mortars or flamethrowers. Still, the gap between the Ha-Go and its eventual American adversaries was widening with every encounter. Meanwhile, Japanese commanders were caught between the realities of limited industrial capacity and the demands of a sprawling empire.
The Ha-Go was cheap to produce, relatively light, and quick to deploy, attributes that suited Japan's immediate strategic needs. But when compared to American production methods, which could field the M4 Sherman with superior armor, a more powerful gun, and fully staffed three-man turrets, the Ha-Go was fundamentally outmatched. In the dense jungles of the Pacific Islands, where mobility was prized but direct confrontation inevitable, these limitations translated into heavy casualties for Japanese crews. By the time American forces landed on Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Peleliu, the weaknesses of the Ha-Go were brutally exposed. Its 37mm cannon was nearly useless against the frontal armor of Sherman tanks, and even heavy machine gun fire could not penetrate the enemy's defenses. Crews found themselves trapped inside cramped steel boxes, often without effective means to communicate, coordinate, or escape. In one documented instance during the Saipan campaign, a small group of Ha-Gos attempted a night counterattack against entrenched American positions. The tanks moved silently through the palm-lined paths, their engines barely audible over the distant gunfire. But once they were spotted, concentrated machine gun and artillery fire tore through the thin armor. Survivors described the chaos of a single-man turret trying to load, aim, and fire while under attack, a task nearly impossible under stress. The engagement ended in complete destruction for the Japanese, illustrating the widening technological gap between the two nations' armored forces. And yet, despite these staggering losses, the Ha-Go remained a cornerstone of Japanese armored doctrine. Its designers and commanders clung to the belief that mobility and tactical cunning could compensate for material shortcomings. Tank crews, for their part, demonstrated extraordinary courage, improvising where equipment failed them and often fighting to the last round. The psychological strain of operating such a vulnerable vehicle in the face of overwhelming firepower cannot be overstated. Letters and memoirs from survivors reveal a mix of pride in their skill, fear of imminent death, and frustration at the limitations of their machines. The contrast between the Ha-Go and American tanks was stark. While U.S. crews could rely on radios to communicate, three-man turrets to distribute responsibilities, and 75mm guns to engage enemy armor at range, Japanese crews were forced to do everything alone in cramped, poorly protected tanks. Every engagement required precise coordination, split-second timing, and an acceptance of risk that would have daunted even the most seasoned soldier. Yet even as the Ha-Go became increasingly obsolete, its legacy was not one of failure alone. The tank embodied a philosophy of war shaped by Japan's unique strategic circumstances. A need for speed, adaptability, and efficiency in an empire with limited resources. It taught valuable lessons about mechanized warfare under extreme conditions and demonstrated the limits of small nations attempting to compete with industrial giants. Engineers studied its performance to inform later designs, officers adapted tactics to account for its weaknesses, and historians would later analyze the Ha-Go to understand why technological gaps could decisively shape outcomes. The story of the Ha-Go also illustrates a larger truth about World War II in the Pacific. Courage and ingenuity could not entirely overcome structural disadvantages in firepower, communication, and production. As Japanese forces advanced across Southeast Asia, the Ha-Go had been an effective instrument of rapid conquest. But when confronted with fully mechanized American forces, supported by overwhelming material superiority, its vulnerabilities became fatal. It is a sobering reminder that in war, the qualities of machines are inseparable from the industrial, strategic, and human contexts in which they are employed. The Type 95 Ha-Go, once celebrated for its mobility and clever engineering, became a tragic symbol of the limits of innovation against a better-equipped adversary. Survivors, historians, and military analysts alike would come to view the tank not just as a vehicle, but as a window into the broader narrative of Japan's industrial and strategic constraints, the human cost of combat, and the brutal arithmetic of mechanized warfare. Its story is one of early triumphs and later heartbreaks, a story of men and machines caught in the unforgiving currents of global conflict. As the war progressed deeper into the Pacific, the Hago tanks found themselves increasingly outmatched by American forces. By the time U.S. Marines landed on islands such as Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, the stark reality of industrial imbalance became painfully clear. While Japanese strategists had once relied on mobility, surprise, and the agility of light armor, the Americans had perfected combined arms operations. Infantry advanced with flamethrowers, bazookas, and machine guns, while artillery and Sherman tanks provided devastating supporting fire. Hago crews, often inexperienced and undertrained, faced a battlefield where speed and cunning could no longer compensate for structural weakness. The 37-millimeter guns that had easily penetrated Chinese or early Malayan defenses were now nearly useless against Sherman tanks, whose sloped armor deflected small-caliber shells. Anti-tank rifles and .5 caliber machine guns, once considered minor threats, now became lethal instruments of destruction. Survivors from these battles recalled that even a slight misstep, a poorly chosen path through a palm grove, a delayed command, a misread signal, could result in immediate death. The single-man turret design exacerbated these risks, forcing the commander to simultaneously observe the battlefield, load and aim the cannon, and coordinate with other tanks or infantry, a cognitive burden that became deadly under fire. On Saipan, one of the most harrowing accounts comes from a Hago platoon attempting to defend a ridge overlooking advancing American positions. The tanks moved in a tight formation, using the rough terrain for cover, but were soon detected by American spotters. Within moments, concentrated fire from machine guns, 75-millimeter tank guns, and artillery tore through the thin steel. Several Hagos were destroyed outright. Others were immobilized, leaving crews stranded and exposed. Witnesses described the chaos vividly. Commanders trying to fire while bullets ricocheted inside the turret, drivers attempting to maneuver over rubble while shrapnel tore through the engine compartment, and crews abandoning tanks under a hail of incoming rounds. The numerical and technological superiority of the Americans rendered such engagements tragic yet inevitable. Beyond the immediate tactical disaster, the encounters revealed larger strategic problems. Japan's industrial capacity could not produce replacement tanks quickly enough, nor could it manufacture heavier armor or more powerful guns to counter American improvements. Each lost Hago represented not just a tactical setback, but a widening material gap that Japanese forces could never hope to close. By contrast, the United States had the logistical capability to replace tanks almost as quickly as they were lost, ensuring a constant flow of reinforcements and maintaining pressure across multiple fronts. The psychological toll on Hago crews was immense. Letters and diary entries convey the sense of fatalism that accompanied each deployment. Many tankers understood that their vehicles offered limited protection, that the odds of survival in a frontal engagement against Sherman tanks were low, and that success often depended on luck as much as skill. Yet, despite these daunting odds, Japanese crews fought with remarkable tenacity. Their actions, while often futile in material terms, demonstrated a commitment to duty and a willingness to face overwhelming firepower with courage. This contrast between technological limitations and human bravery encapsulates the tragic elegance of the Hago story. Even as individual tanks were destroyed, they forced the Americans to adjust tactics, to coordinate more closely, and to recognize the enduring value of disciplined opposition no matter how lightly armored. The final years of the war saw the Hago increasingly relegated to secondary roles. On islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, they were often used as static defensive positions or to support infantry in fortified areas. In these scenarios, their speed and mobility were largely negated,
and their vulnerability was fully exposed. Yet, even in this diminished role, the tanks occasionally achieved tactical successes, ambushing advancing forces, delaying assaults, or creating pockets of confusion. Such episodes were rare, but serve as reminders of the ingenuity inherent in both the machine and its operators. By 1945, the Hago had become a relic of an earlier era of mechanized warfare. Its once prized qualities, speed, agility, and ease of production, were overshadowed by the realities of industrial-scale conflict and modern combined arms tactics. Japanese forces could no longer rely on light armor to secure victories, and crews faced the grim choice of fighting with inadequate tools or surrendering.
Historians, looking back at the Hago, emphasize that its story is not merely one of technological inadequacy, but of the broader dynamics of the Pacific War. It illustrates how industrial capacity, strategic planning, and resource allocation directly influence the outcomes of battles. A single tank, no matter how well handled, cannot compensate for systemic disadvantages. The Hago also provides insight into the human dimensions of mechanized warfare. Crews demonstrated extraordinary resilience, improvising tactics, coordinating as best they could without radios, and attempting to extract maximum utility from a vehicle that offered minimal protection. These accounts provide a window into the daily realities of frontline soldiers, the constant threat of sudden death, the improvisation required to survive, and the courage demanded by machines that were, in many ways, inadequate for the tasks assigned to them. The legacy of the Hago extends beyond its combat record. It shaped Japanese armored doctrine, influenced later tank designs, and became a case study in the interplay between technological innovation and strategic necessity. Engineers analyzed its performance to understand both strengths and failures, while military leaders evaluated its operational history to guide tactical planning. The tank also serves as a symbol in popular memory, representing both the ingenuity and the limitations of Japan's wartime military effort. In retrospect, the Hago's story underscores the unforgiving logic of mechanized warfare. Courage, skill, and tactical cleverness could achieve temporary successes, but sustained victory required alignment of design, production, and strategy. The United States' ability to mass-produce superior tanks, equip crews with radios, and coordinate combined arms assaults created an environment in which the Hago, for all its early promise, could no longer compete. Yet in the narrative of World War II, the Hago is more than a failed tank. It is a testament to human effort under extreme conditions, a symbol of adaptation in the face of constraints, and a reminder that history often balances heroism with tragedy. Survivors' memoirs, wartime reports, and post-war analyses all converge on the same conclusion. The Type 95 Hago light tank, once celebrated in the early campaigns for its mobility and clever engineering, ultimately became a symbol of both Japan's tactical brilliance and its strategic vulnerability. It carried men into battle with skill and bravery, yet exposed them to the fatal consequences of technological inferiority. The courage of its crews, the ingenuity of its designers, and the stark lessons of its engagements with American forces together form a narrative that is both sobering and illuminating. Even today, as historians study the Pacific War and audiences watch documentaries recounting the courage of those who fought on both sides, the story of the Hago reminds us of the human and material dimensions that shape history. It is a story of machines, men, and the unforgiving arithmetic of war, a tale in which victory depended not just on skill, but on the interplay of industry, strategy, and the human will to persevere under impossible circumstances. In the end, the Hago's legacy is inseparable from the broader story of the Pacific War. It teaches us that technology matters, that courage alone cannot win battles,
and that the design of machines and the resolve of those who operate them are forever intertwined. Its journey from early triumph in China to tragic obsolescence against the industrial might of the United States captures the essence of a conflict defined by innovation, sacrifice, and the relentless march of modern warfare. The Type 95 Hago light tank, once celebrated in the early campaigns for its mobility and clever engineering, ultimately became a symbol of both Japan's tactical brilliance and its strategic vulnerability. It carried men into battle with skill and bravery, yet exposed them to the fatal consequences of technological inferiority. The courage of its crews, the ingenuity of its designers, and the stark lessons of its engagements with American forces together form a narrative that is both sobering and illuminating. Even today, as historians study the Pacific War and audiences watch documentaries recounting the courage of those who fought on both sides, the story of the Hago reminds us of the human and material dimensions that shape history. It is a story of machines, men, and the unforgiving arithmetic of war, a tale in which victory depended not just on skill, but on the interplay of industry, strategy, and the human will to persevere under impossible circumstances. In the end, the Hago's legacy is inseparable from the broader story of the Pacific War. It teaches us that technology matters, that courage alone cannot win battles, and that the design of machines and the resolve of those who operate them are forever intertwined. Its journey from early triumph in China to tragic obsolescence against the industrial might of the United States captures the essence of a conflict defined by innovation, sacrifice, and the relentless march of modern warfare. The Type 95 Hago light tank, small and vulnerable though it was, endures in history as a symbol of both human ingenuity and the harsh truths of mechanized combat.